At my wedding reception, I noticed something strange tucked inside my brand new husband's leather carry-on while we were packing for our honeymoon the very next morning: a woman's passport. Not mine. Not anyone I knew. Just a glossy navy blue booklet with the name, Vanessa Cole, embossed inside, along with a first-class boarding pass to Santorini, on the exact same flight as ours. I just smiled and zipped the suitcase shut. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment where you're watching from, because what happened after I found that passport turned my fairy tale wedding into the most calculated lesson of my 68 years. I had always believed weddings, especially at my age, were proof that life could still surprise you kindly. After losing my first husband, Daniel, to pancreatic cancer 12 years earlier, I never imagined I'd wear ivory again. At 68, I wasn't chasing some fantasy of youth. I wasn't naive. Or at least, I didn't think I was. I simply believed companionship could still exist for women like me. Women with silver hair, careful hearts, and enough life behind them to recognize sincerity. Thomas made me believe that. He was 72. Charming in that polished, country club sort of way. A retired financial advisor with kind eyes, measured words, and the habit of always pulling out my chair before I sat down. He said all the right things. That I was elegant. That I was wise. That I made him feel less alone. And after 5 years of widowhood, loneliness can make even cautious women hope. Our wedding had been small but beautiful. A historic inn in Vermont. Autumn leaves blazing red and gold. Fresh ivory roses on every table. My granddaughter Elise cried when I walked down the aisle. Even my son, Gregory, who had initially been skeptical, hugged Thomas warmly at the reception. For one evening, everything felt blessed. The champagne sparkled. The string quartet played. Unforgettable. My lace sleeves fit perfectly. And when Thomas held my hand during our first dance, I remember thinking, maybe God really does give second chances. By noon the next day, I realized I hadn't married a second chance. I had married a man with secrets. We were in the presidential suite, sunlight spilling across the carpet, half-packed luggage open on the bed. Thomas was downstairs handling checkout, while I carefully folded my linen resort wear beside his things. I remember smiling as I placed my sun hat into my suitcase. Then his carry-on tipped sideways. A side pocket fell open. Out slid the passport. At first, I assumed it belonged to a relative. Perhaps his daughter. Maybe an old travel document. But then I saw the boarding pass. Vanessa Cole. Seat 2A. Thomas was seated 2B. And I was in 4C. My fingers went cold. I stared at that ticket longer than I'd stared at my own reflection in the bridal mirror the day before. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe. But deep down, in that quiet place women my age learn never to ignore, something inside me had already shifted. Because for the first time since saying, I do, I wasn't feeling like a bride. I was feeling like a woman who had just discovered she'd been strategically placed, 3 rows behind the truth. The hotel suite still looked like the ending of a love story. White roses from the reception sat in crystal vases on every surface. My wedding gown hung carefully by the window, its lace catching the Vermont sunlight like something sacred. 2 champagne flutes remained on the nightstand, one with my lipstick still faintly marking the rim. Everything around me looked like romance. But in my hands I held evidence that something was very wrong. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, Vanessa Cole's passport resting in my lap like a loaded weapon I hadn't asked to carry. My heart wasn't racing the way younger women in movies always seem to. It was quieter than that. Heavier. At 68, betrayal doesn't always arrive like a scream. Sometimes it arrives like silence so deep, you can hear your entire past rearranging itself. I opened the passport again. Vanessa was 42. Blonde. Beautiful in that polished, expensive way women in luxury skincare ads always seem to be. Her photos showed perfect teeth, smooth skin, and the kind of confident smile that suggested she was used to being chosen. A folded receipt slipped from between its pages. Dinner at Le Bernardin in New York. 2 weeks. Earlier. 2 guests. I stared at the elegant print until the words blurred. Thomas had told me he'd been in Boston that weekend visiting his brother after a minor surgery. I remembered because I'd sent soup to his house when he returned. Chicken and wild rice. His favorite. My fingers tightened. Still, I didn't cry. Not then. Women my age know tears can wait. Facts cannot. So I did what I'd spent decades doing as a wife, mother, and later widow. I paid attention. I placed everything exactly where I'd found it. Passport. Ticket. Receipt. Then I zipped the bag closed. By the time Thomas walked back into the suite, smiling and holding 2 coffees, I was standing by the mirror applying lipstick. "There's my beautiful bride," he said, handing me the cup. "Ready for paradise?" I smiled the same smile I'd worn yesterday in front of the minister. "Almost," I said. If my voice shook, he didn't notice. Or maybe men like Thomas only notice what threatens them. He kissed my cheek and began talking about airport timing, weather in Santorini, and how he'd arranged something special for our honeymoon suite. I listened. I nodded. I even laughed once. But for the first time, I wasn't hearing my husband. I was hearing every strange moment I'd dismissed over the past 18 months. The private phone calls he'd take outside. The way he'd suddenly password-protected his tablet. How he insisted on handling all travel bookings himself, saying, "Let me spoil you." At the time, it had sounded thoughtful. Now, sitting there in my pearl earrings and fresh marriage, it sounded strategic. I glanced at our printed itinerary on the dresser. Thomas Reed, Seat 2B. Evelyn Reed, Seat 4C. And somewhere nearby, if nothing changed, Vanessa Cole, Seat 2A. I wanted to demand answers right there beside Gate 6. But widowhood had taught me something younger women often learn later: panic can destroy evidence. And if I was being deceived, I needed facts more than fury. I had been married less than 24 hours. And already, I was beginning to understand something devastating. I wasn't the wife on this honeymoon. I was the cover story. The drive to Burlington International Airport should have felt romantic. Newlyweds. Matching luggage. First-class tickets to Greece. Instead, every mile felt like I was being chauffeured deeper into someone else's lie. Thomas drove with one hand on the wheel and the other occasionally resting on mine, as though nothing had changed. As though I hadn't found another woman's passport tucked beside his shaving kit less than 2 hours earlier. "You're quiet," he said with a soft chuckle as we passed orange and crimson trees blazing across Vermont hillsides. "Don't tell me you're already tired of me." I turned toward him and smiled gently. "Just overwhelmed," I said. "It's been a big weekend." That much, at least, was true. He squeezed my hand, satisfied. "You deserve this, Evelyn," he said. "No more loneliness. Just us now. Just us." Funny how lies always sound sweetest when they're polished in reassurance. I stared out the window and let him talk. About the private catamaran he'd booked. About sunset dinners in Santorini. About the villa overlooking the caldera. Every word sounded expensive. And suddenly, so did I. Because beneath the softness in his voice, a harder question had begun forming in my mind. Why marry me, if another woman was coming too? By the time we arrived at the airport, I had already stopped thinking like a bride. I was thinking like a woman who had survived breast cancer at 61, buried one good husband at 56, raised 2 children, balanced household budgets for 40 years, and once caught a contractor stealing copper pipes from our lake house renovation. I knew deception when I stopped romanticizing it. Inside the terminal, Thomas insisted on handling check-in. "Sit down, sweetheart," he said warmly. "I'll take care of everything." Of course he would. I watched from a row of leather seats near the window, my cream blazer folded neatly across my lap, as Thomas approached the airline counter. And then I saw her. Blonde. Camel trench coat. Oversized sunglasses. Early 40s. Vanessa. I recognized her instantly from the passport photo, though in person she was somehow even more polished. She didn't approach Thomas like a stranger. She approached him like a woman accustomed to being expected. Not too close. Not too obvious. But close enough. He didn't kiss her. Didn't touch her. He simply leaned slightly toward her while handing over documents, and in that small movement, one subtle familiarity, my entire stomach turned. She smiled first. Not a flirtatious smile. A confident one. The kind women wear when they are not guessing their place in a man's life. I lowered my gaze before either of them noticed me watching. Then I saw something else. Thomas handed the agent 3 passports. 3. Not separately. Together. My pulse didn't spike. It chilled. A few minutes later, he returned carrying our boarding passes, smiling like the devoted husband everyone at my wedding believed him to be. All set, he said cheerfully. I took my ticket. Seat 4C. I looked up at him with calm eyes I no longer entirely recognized as naive. And you? I asked lightly. 2B, he said. They said the flight was nearly full. Couldn't get us together, but we'll switch once we board. I nodded. Of course. That was when I learned something important about betrayal. It rarely collapses under confrontation. No. If you want the truth, sometimes you have to let people believe their performance is still working. So I smiled. And for the first time since saying, I do, I began planning like a woman with nothing left to lose. I have always believed airports reveal the truth about people. Not in the grand ways. Not through dramatic confessions or cinematic chases through crowded terminals. But in the small things. Who walks ahead? Who waits? Who keeps checking their phone? Who smiles too carefully? Burlington International wasn't particularly large, but that morning it felt enormous. Bright windows. Rolling suitcases. Families corralling children. Business travelers with coffee cups and impatient shoes. And me. A 68-year-old bride in pearl earrings, sitting quietly beside a charging station, watching my husband move between 2 women as though he were managing a complicated calendar instead of a dangerous lie. Thomas kept glancing at me just enough to maintain appearances. A reassuring smile. A small wave. The occasional, "Be right back, sweetheart." Sweetheart. It was almost impressive how easily some men weaponized tenderness. Vanessa, meanwhile, had positioned herself near an international departures screen, pretending to scroll through her phone. But once you've spent decades raising children, hosting PTA fundraisers, navigating church politics, and surviving suburban social circles, you learn something useful. Women may lie with words, but posture usually tells the truth. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't confused. She wasn't wondering. She was waiting. For him. I stood slowly and smoothed my blazer, pretending to stretch my legs. Then I did something Thomas had likely never imagined I would do. I walked directly past him. "Bathroom," I said with an absent smile. He nodded instantly, relieved by how easy I still seemed. But I didn't go to the restroom. I went to the customer service desk. A younger woman with auburn hair and tired but kind eyes greeted me. "Good morning. How can I help you?" I lowered my voice, polite and composed. "I believe there may be an error with my seating assignment," I said. "My husband and I were separated, and I'd just like clarification." She typed quickly. Then paused. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "I see your reservation, Mrs. Reed." I smiled gently. "And?" She hesitated the way decent people do when they've accidentally discovered something painful. "You are seated in Comfort Plus, row 4. "Yes." She swallowed. "Mr. Reed and Miss Cole are seated together in Delta 1. Mississippi. Not Mrs. Not family friend. Miss Cole. Together. No airline mistake. No seating shortage. No last-minute inconvenience. Just deliberate placement. A honeymoon package for 2. And I, apparently, was the decorative addition 4 rows back. For one strange second, I thought I might faint. Not because my heart was broken, but because humiliation has a physical weight no one warns you about. It settles in your chest, your throat, your spine. Still, I kept my face calm. "Thank you," I said softly. Then I added words that surprised even me. "Could you print the full booking details?" The woman looked at me carefully. Woman to woman. Then she nodded. When the paper slid across the desk, my fingers did not tremble. 3 tickets. Booked 6 months ago. 1 luxury honeymoon suite. 2 premium excursions. 1 secondary adjoining room. And the contact email listed on the reservation was not Thomas's. It was Vanessa's. I stared at that page long enough to understand something that changed me forever. This wasn't an affair that interrupted my wedding. My wedding had been built around their affair. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my purse. Then I thanked the woman, reapplied my lipstick in a nearby mirror, and walked back toward my husband. Thomas smiled when he saw me coming, holding out a latte he bought exactly how I liked it. Extra hot. 1 sugar. For the first time, I realized something devastating. He had studied me very well. Just not well enough. For one fragile moment, I almost convinced myself there had to be some misunderstanding. A business arrangement. A travel error. Something less cruel than what my instincts were whispering. But at my age, I had learned that confusion is often the first refuge of betrayal. So instead of confronting him with fear, I chose something far more useful. I stayed quiet, and waited for truth to make the next move. I took the latte. I even thanked him. Because after 68 years, I've learned something women like me are rarely taught when we're young. The person who stays calm controls the room. Thomas smiled, clearly reassured, and slipped an arm around my waist as though we were simply another happy couple headed for Europe. "There she is," he said warmly. "Everything okay?" I looked directly into the face of the man I had married less than 24 hours earlier. And I smiled. "Perfect," I said. Not because I was fine, but because men like Thomas often mistake composure for ignorance. He guided me toward the Delta Lounge with practiced ease, wheeling both our carry-ons while occasionally glancing over his shoulder, not at me. At Vanessa. It was subtle. So subtle most people would have missed it. But once betrayal sharpens your senses, even a half-second look can feel louder than a confession. Inside the lounge, polished marble counters gleamed beneath soft pendant lights. Business travelers sipped espresso. A retired couple argued affectionately over muffins. Everything looked civilized. That was the strange thing about devastation. It can happen in beautiful places. Thomas kissed my temple. "I'm going to make a quick call before boarding," he said. "Can you find us seats?" Us. Such a small word. Such a massive lie. "Of course," I replied. He disappeared down a hallway near the private business booths. I counted to 10. Then I stood. I didn't follow immediately. Panic makes noise. Strategy requires timing. When I finally turned the corner, I stopped just before the alcove and heard Vanessa's voice first. Low. Irritated. "How much longer do we keep doing this?" Then Thomas. Calm. Familiar. Annoyingly patient. "Just until the transfer clears. Evelyn trusts me. Once the Santorini paperwork is finalized and the joint accounts are active, we don't need the performance anymore." My knees nearly buckled. Transfer. Joint accounts. Performance. For a moment, the world became unnaturally sharp. The silver trim on the glass door. The scent of roasted coffee. The sound of someone laughing 50 feet away. I had not been chosen. I had been targeted. Vanessa spoke again, her tone edged with impatience. "You promised this would be done before the ceremony." Thomas sighed. "She insisted on a traditional wedding. Family, photos, all of it. We play along, we secure the estate access, and then we move on." Estate access. Not love. Not companionship. Not second chances. My home in Connecticut. My late husband Daniel's investment portfolio. The lake cottage Gregory kept begging me never to sell. That was the honeymoon. Not Greece. Me. I stepped back before either of them could see me, each movement careful, deliberate. Then I returned to my seat near the lounge windows and picked up my handbag with steady hands. Inside was my phone, my attorney's business card, and the prenuptial packet Thomas had insisted we finalize later, after the wedding, because love mattered more than paperwork. I nearly laughed. Poor Thomas. He thought age made me slower. He forgot age also makes women dangerous when they've got nothing left to prove. I called my attorney, Margaret Holloway, before boarding even began. She answered on the second ring. Evelyn? Shouldn't you be on your honeymoon? I stared across the lounge as my husband emerged moments later, smiling at me like a man standing on the edge of victory. No, I said quietly. I think I'm about to prevent a robbery. Margaret Holloway had been my attorney for 19 years. She handled Daniel's estate after cancer took him. She protected me when a roofing contractor tried to forge invoices after a hailstorm. She once described herself, quite modestly, as pleasant until necessary. At that moment, necessary had arrived. Evelyn, she said after listening to exactly 32 seconds of my whispering from a quiet corner near Gate 6, do not board that plane until you email me every document you have. I have the booking printout, I said softly. And I never signed the revised trust paperwork Thomas kept postponing. Good, she replied, her voice sharpening. That means access isn't complete. For the first time since finding Vanessa's passport, I felt something stronger than shock. Relief. Because betrayal is painful. But unfinished betrayal? That can still be stopped. Margaret moved quickly. She instructed me to forward photos of our marriage certificate, the honeymoon reservation details, and every financial document Thomas had encouraged me to simplify. After the wedding. Also, she added, call Cedar Ridge Bank immediately. Freeze any pending joint authorization requests. I glanced toward Thomas. He was standing near the bar now, laughing softly at something Vanessa said while pretending not to stand too close. I opened my banking app. Sure enough, there it was. Pending request, Thomas Reed, secondary account holder authorization. Submitted at 6:42 a.m. While I was in the shower. I stared at the screen so hard my vision blurred for one dangerous second. Not because I was weak. Because cruelty this calculated still has the power to surprise decent people. My thumb didn't hesitate. Deny. Then I called the bank. My voice was calm enough that the representative likely assumed this was routine. It's urgent, I said. Flag all estate-connected accounts. No additions. No transfers. No beneficiary modifications without direct verbal authorization from me and my attorney. Within minutes, alerts were placed. Passwords reset. Wire restrictions activated. 42 years of marriage to Daniel had taught me how to build security. Thomas had made the mistake of assuming widowhood erased intelligence. When I hung up, Margaret was still working. I'm filing an emergency marital asset protection notice, she said. And Evelyn? Yes? Do not confront him yet. I almost smiled. Oh, Margaret, I said quietly, watching Thomas adjust his expensive watch while Vanessa checked boarding updates beside him. I have no intention of ruining his plan early. There was a pause. Then, for the first time that morning, my attorney laughed. That's my girl. Boarding began 20 minutes later. Delta 1 passengers first. Vanessa stepped forward elegantly. Thomas turned back toward me with polished concern. Sweetheart, they're boarding our section. Come on. Our section. Such confidence. Such arrogance. I rose slowly, adjusted my silk scarf, and picked up my handbag. Then I did something simple. Something small. Something devastating. I handed Thomas his boarding pass. Only his. A faint line appeared between his brows. Where's yours? I looked him directly in the eye, The same way I had when I promised. For better or worse. Less than a day ago. I made other arrangements. I wasn't expecting handcuffs or dramatic justice in an airport terminal. Real consequences rarely arrive that theatrically. But Margaret had done something better. She had activated financial fraud alerts, flagged pending transfers, and alerted Delta's corporate security team that my identity and assets may have been used under deceptive circumstances. I didn't need a scene. I only needed their plan interrupted. I said. Vanessa froze. Thomas blinked. And for the first time since our wedding vows, my husband looked uncertain. Good. Because while they had spent months building a performance around my trust, I had just begun rewriting the ending. Thomas laughed first. Not loudly. Just a small, polished chuckle, the kind men use when they believe confusion is temporary and control is still theirs. Evelyn, he said, lowering his voice as though I were an aging wife having a harmless little episode. What does that mean? Behind him, Vanessa had gone very still. I adjusted the strap of my handbag and smiled with all the grace 68 years, widowhood, motherhood, and betrayal had taught me. It means, I said calmly, you should probably board before they close the gate. For one suspended second, no one moved. Passengers shuffled around us. A toddler cried near security. Boarding agents scanned passports with mechanical cheerfulness. And there we stood. A husband. His mistress. And the woman they had mistaken for easy prey. Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice further. Evelyn, if this is about seating, I already explained. Oh, I know. I interrupted gently. You've explained quite a lot today. His jaw tightened. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because men like Thomas are rarely prepared for women who don't collapse on schedule. Vanessa finally spoke, her tone smooth but cautious. Thomas. Interesting, isn't it? She said his name the way a partner does when a plan begins slipping. Not like a stranger. Not like a friend. Like an accomplice checking structural damage. I reached into my purse, pulled out the printed itinerary from customer service, and handed it to him in front of her. 3 names. 2 adjoining luxury reservations. 1 manipulated bride. His eyes scanned the page. And for the first time, Thomas Reed lost color. Evelyn, no, I said softly. I wasn't loud. I didn't need to be. After all, dignity can cut deeper than volume. You married me yesterday, I continued, while planning an international vacation with another woman using my assets as your retirement strategy. A nearby couple stopped talking. The gate agent looked up. Vanessa's polished composure cracked first. This is not what it looks like, she snapped. I turned to her then. Really turned. And I will admit something honestly. There is a particular kind of power in looking directly at the woman who thought your life was negotiable. You're right, I said. It's significantly worse. Thomas reached for my elbow, likely hoping physical closeness could still manufacture authority. I stepped back before he touched me. That small movement said more than shouting ever could. Cedar Ridge accounts are frozen, I said evenly. Margaret has the documentation. Fraud investigators will have copies before your layover. Now he looked afraid. Not embarrassed. Afraid. There's a difference. Because embarrassment worries about appearances. Fear worries about consequences. Evelyn, please, he whispered, his charm finally cracking under pressure. Let's not do this here. I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I remembered the passport. The phone call. The phrase estate access. So I gave him the same mercy he had offered me. None. Oh, Thomas, I said quietly. You did this here. The boarding agent cleared her throat. Sir? Are you boarding? Vanessa looked at him. I looked at him. And suddenly, for perhaps the first time in his carefully curated life, Thomas had no script. He could chase the honeymoon. Or salvage the target. But not both. He chose either quickly enough. Because 2 airport security officers were already walking toward us, directed by a woman from customer service with auburn hair and an excellent memory. Margaret had been faster than he expected. And I, the bride he seated in 4C, had just moved the entire flight plan. Airport security is a peculiar thing. It moves quietly at first. No sirens. No dramatic shouting. Just calm shoes on polished floors and expressions that tell you the performance is over. The two officers approached with professional restraint, their dark uniforms neat, their voices low enough not to create spectacle, but firm enough that everyone nearby understood something serious had shifted. "Mr. Reed?" one asked. Thomas turned slowly, the confident groom from yesterday now looking more like a man suddenly aware his reflection had changed. "Yes? We need to speak with you regarding a reported financial fraud concern. Not accusation. Not arrest. Just enough truth to stop movement." Vanessa's face drained so quickly it almost startled me. "Financial fraud?" she repeated, far too fast, far too sharply. Interesting how guilty people often reveal themselves by rushing to outrun language. I stood quietly, one hand resting on my handbag, watching 20 months of manipulation begin collapsing under 10 words and a paused boarding process. Thomas tried smiling. I'll give him this, he was committed to charm until the bitter end. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "My wife and I, formerly pending legal spouse," I corrected gently. That landed. Not loudly, but precisely. Because while he'd been focused on wire transfers and luxury suites, Margaret had already done something beautiful. She'd filed an emergency petition questioning marital coercion and asset-targeted fraud before our plane ever left Vermont. In other words, by the time Thomas tried using the word wife as protection, the law had already started asking whether husband had been earned honestly. The officer nodded politely. "Sir, we'll need you to step aside." Vanessa touched his arm. "Thomas." And there it was again. Not confusion. Not innocence. Partnership under pressure. He looked at her then, really looked, and I saw something fascinating pass between them: blame. Because schemes built on greed often collapse the second consequences arrive. "Ma'am," the second officer said to Vanessa, "we'll need to verify your travel documentation as well." She stiffened. "Oh, I'm not involved in." But of course she was. 3 tickets. Shared bookings. Financial email trail. Not every betrayal requires romance. Sometimes greed is intimacy enough. Around us, boarding continued. Life always does. Families scanned passports. Flight attendants smiled. A little girl in pigtails asked her father for pretzels. And standing there in my ivory cashmere sweater, the one I'd bought specifically for Santorini, I realized something almost surreal. My life was not ending in this airport. It was being returned to me. Thomas glanced back at me one final time as security escorted them toward a private office. "Evelyn," he said, his voice stripped now of polish. "Please. You're making a mistake." No. I had made the mistake yesterday. Today, I was correcting it. I walked closer, close enough that only he could hear me. "You didn't break my heart," I said quietly. "You tried to bill it." Then I stepped back. Vanessa looked like she wanted to speak, perhaps defend herself, perhaps rewrite her role from accomplice to misunderstanding. I gave her nothing. Because closure is a gift. And I had already spent enough. A boarding announcement for Santorini echoed overhead. Final call. How poetic. Their honeymoon was still boarding. But without my money. Without my trust. And without me. I watched as they disappeared behind security doors, not as lovers bound for paradise, but as 2 very nervous travelers heading somewhere far less comfortable. Then my phone rang. "Margaret." "Well?" she asked. I looked down at my unused boarding pass. Seat 4C. I smiled for real this time. "Tell Delta," I said, "I'd like to upgrade my destination." I did not go to Santorini. At least, not the way Thomas had planned. Instead of boarding a flight built on deception, I stood at Gate 6 in Burlington International Airport, holding a cancelled honeymoon itinerary in one hand and a fresh cup of black coffee in the other, while my attorney quietly helped dismantle the most expensive mistake of my later years. "Where do you actually want to go?" Margaret asked through the phone. It was such a simple question. And after 24 hours of discovering that my marriage had been orchestrated like a financial ambush, simple felt revolutionary. I looked out the terminal windows at planes lifting cleanly into a pale Vermont sky and realized something I hadn't asked myself in far too long. If no one was manipulating me, what did I want? Not what Thomas promised. Not what grief had settled for. Me. So I answered honestly. "Napa." Margaret laughed. "Napa?" "Yes," I said, surprising even myself. "I'd like good wine, expensive sheets, and absolutely no liars." For the first time in nearly 2 days, laughter rose from somewhere real inside me. By noon, Delta had rebooked me to San Francisco. First class, courtesy of a very compassionate supervisor named Elena who, after hearing a sanitized version of events, simply said, "Honey, let's get you somewhere better." Women saving women? Never underestimate it. While waiting for my new departure, I sat in the lounge and began doing something far more satisfying than honeymoon planning. I rebuilt my life. Margaret emailed. Updated legal documents. Temporary injunctions. Fraud notices. Asset protections. She also uncovered something even more disturbing. Thomas had attempted similar late-life marriages twice before. Not legally identical, but close enough. Short engagements. Financial integration pressure. Sudden travel. Delayed paperwork. I wasn't his first emotional investment strategy. I was simply the wealthiest. That truth stung. Not because it diminished me, but because it revealed how professionally he had studied vulnerability. Widows. Loneliness. Trust. He hadn't fallen in love with me. He had profiled me. By the time I boarded my flight to California, I had already authorized a full forensic review of every financial conversation Thomas and I had ever had. Emails. Voicemails. Property discussions. Even the suspiciously persistent suggestions about adding his name to Daniel's lake house. Piece by piece, what I had once called romance now looked more like reconnaissance. And strangely, that freed me. Because heartbreak asks, was I not enough? But fraud asks a different question. What were they trying to take? One question destroys self-worth. The other restores it. Somewhere over Colorado, sipping sparkling water at 35,000 feet, I removed my wedding ring. Not dramatically. No tears. No speech. I simply slid it off, placed it in the airline napkin beside my glass, and exhaled. A younger flight attendant noticed. "Everything okay?" I looked at the ring for a long second. Then I smiled. "It is now." In Napa, I checked into a vineyard resort Thomas never knew existed. Private balcony. Rolling hills. September sun. No shared suite. That first evening, wrapped in a robe softer than regret, I sat alone on a terrace overlooking rows of gold-green vines and understood something my younger self may have missed. Being alone is not the same as being deceived. One is peaceful. The other is theft. My phone buzzed just before sunset. Gregory. My son. "Mom!" Margaret called. "Are you okay?" I stared out at the vineyard's glowing amber. And for the first time since my wedding, I answered without confusion. "Yes," I said. "I think I finally am. Because sometimes the worst day of your life is not the day you were betrayed. Sometimes it's the day you stop betraying yourself by staying." By the third morning in Napa, healing, I discovered, did not mean ignoring what happened. Peace gave me enough distance to do something grief never could, examine the damage clearly. And once Margaret began pulling financial records, travel histories, and prior engagement patterns, this stopped looking like one woman's heartbreak. It started looking like evidence. The fog rolled over the vineyards like silk being drawn gently across glass. Quiet. Soft. Honest. Nothing like the wedding. I had begun waking early, not because anxiety dragged me from sleep the way it had during those first shattered hours, but because peace has its own rhythm. I'd sit on the terrace in a cream robe, coffee warming my hands, watching the sun slowly burn through silver mist while attorneys on the East Coast dismantled the illusion I had nearly handed my life to. Margaret was relentless. By Wednesday, she had secured an emergency annulment filing based on fraudulent inducement, financial deception, and documented coercive intent. In simpler terms, Thomas hadn't just lied. He had entered marriage under false pretenses with measurable financial strategy. Exactly the kind of thing judges tend to dislike. But Margaret didn't stop there. She hired a private investigator. And that, as it turned out, was where Thomas Reed's carefully tailored world truly began to split open. His retirement portfolio was inflated. His Palm Beach condo? Leased, not owned. His claims of managing wealth for prominent families? Exaggerated enough to be laughable. And Vanessa Cole? Not an accidental mistress. Not a midlife crisis. Not even particularly original. She had been linked to him for nearly 4 years. 4 years. Together, they had attended luxury seminars, cruise investment mixers, and widow-focused retirement networking events across 3 states. Widow-focused. I read that phrase twice. Then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. I wasn't unlucky. I had been selected. Their pattern was chilling in its simplicity. Find emotionally vulnerable women with substantial assets. Build trust. Fast-track romance. Delay legal scrutiny. Encourage financial blending. Exit richer. It was less love story, more business model. I should have felt humiliated. Instead, I felt furious in a way that was strangely clarifying. Because shame belongs to deception only when the victim accepts responsibility for another person's character. I did not. So I shifted. Margaret and I made a decision over grilled salmon and Napa Chardonnay during a 2-hour call from my suite balcony. We would not simply protect me. We would document everything. Every text Thomas sent. Every postponed legal form. Every travel booking. Every suspicious introduction. Every woman, if possible. If Thomas and Vanessa had treated vulnerable women like opportunities, then I intended to become their worst investment. Gregory flew in that Friday. The moment I saw my son crossing the resort lobby, still in his navy blazer, tie loosened, worry all over his face, I remembered something grief had nearly made me forget. I was not alone. He hugged me so tightly I nearly cried for the first time. Not because I was broken, but because real love feels profoundly different after counterfeit. "Mom," he said, pulling back just enough to look me over. "I swear to God if I see him." I touched his cheek the way I used to when he was little. "You won't," I said calmly. "Men like Thomas don't survive exposure by standing still." Gregory stayed the weekend. We drank wine. We reviewed documents. We laughed, occasionally, at the absurdity of how spectacularly Thomas had underestimated the family he thought he was infiltrating. Because here was his fatal mistake. He thought he married an isolated widow. He actually married a woman with resources, memory, legal counsel, and children who do not forgive predators. That Sunday evening, Margaret called again. "Evelyn," she said, and I could hear satisfaction in her usually disciplined voice. "You may want to sit down." I looked at Gregory. He raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Margaret exhaled once. "Vanessa just filed a statement." Silence. Then, "She's claiming Thomas was planning to cut her out too." I leaned back slowly, staring out at Golden Vineyard Rows stretching towards sunset. Well, isn't that poetic? Because greed may recruit partners. But eventually, it always turns on itself. Vanessa's statement arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Not in some dramatic courtroom reveal. Not with flashing cameras or whispered scandal. Just a PDF in Margaret's inbox, forwarded to me while I sat wrapped in a cashmere throw on my Napa balcony, oatmeal growing cold beside me, the vineyard below still silver with dawn. Funny, isn't it? How life-altering betrayals often arrive looking so ordinary. Gregory was already there, reading emails from his office while pretending not to monitor my reaction every 5 minutes. Protective. Tense. My boy had always gotten that from Daniel. I opened the file. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. Vanessa, apparently abandoned by Thomas the moment federal financial investigators began reviewing his accounts, had decided cooperation was now her best survival strategy. Predictable. Her statement was 43 pages long. 43. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Women in love write excuses. Women betrayed by greed write documentation. Page by page, Vanessa detailed what Thomas had hidden: multiple alias business names, 3 prior romantic financial schemes targeting widows in Connecticut, Arizona, and North Carolina, false investment seminars, forged emotional narratives about dead relatives, even rehearsed proposal language. Rehearsed. I had to stop reading for a moment after that. Not because my heart broke again, but because I suddenly remembered the exact night Thomas proposed beneath those twinkling patio lights outside the Hartford Symphony Gala. The navy velvet box. The trembling voice. "Evelyn, I thought life was over until you." Scripted. Every beautiful word, product tested for extraction. Gregory swore under his breath from across the table. But I just kept reading. And then came the line that changed everything. Thomas had privately referred to me in emails as the Connecticut anchor. Not Evelyn. Not fiancé. Not wife. Anchor. As in stable assets. Legacy estate. Long-term access. I stared at that phrase until all humiliation evaporated. Because humiliation requires emotional ownership. And suddenly I felt none. Only clarity. He had never truly known me. He had assessed me. That distinction matters. By noon, Margaret had coordinated with federal investigators, state fraud divisions, and 2 other attorneys representing previous women Thomas had targeted. 2 of those women were over 70. One had lost nearly $400,000. Another had signed partial medical power of attorney before her daughter intervened. I sat there reading their stories, and something inside me changed permanently. This was no longer about my wedding. This was about pattern interruption. So I made a decision. I would testify. Not because I needed revenge, but because silence is often the final gift predators expect. And I was done giving. Within 2 weeks, Thomas's accounts were frozen across multiple jurisdictions. Civil complaints multiplied. Vanessa, in exchange for reduced liability, turned over private messages, offshore transfer drafts, and a spreadsheet labeled Legacy Prospects. Legacy. Prospects. Rows of women. Ages. Assets. Family status. Widowhood. I was line 7. Line 7. I should have shattered. Instead, I printed it, framed it, and placed it in my home office beside Daniel's old oak desk. Not as trauma. As evidence. A reminder that evil often looks polished before it looks dangerous. When I finally returned to Connecticut, the annulment hearing was swift. Fraud voids many things, including illusion. Thomas tried calling 3 times before the final judgment. I never answered. His last voicemail was only 12 seconds. "Evelyn, please. You know part of it was real." I deleted it without finishing. Because here is what age teaches: if you let it, partial sincerity inside calculated exploitation is still exploitation. A drop of truth does not purify poison. 3 months later, I hosted a dinner party at my lake house. Same dining room Thomas once admired. Same chandelier. Same inherited china. But this time, every seat was filled by people who had earned their place. Gregory. Elise. Margaret. 2 women Thomas had previously deceived. And me. At the head of the table. Not because I needed power. Because I had reclaimed authorship. I raised my wine glass that night and said something simple. To second chances. Gregory smiled. Margaret smirked. And I added with perfect peace. Just not with the same mistake wearing a different suit. 6 months after my wedding day, I stood in the same Vermont inn where I had once said, I do. Only this time, I came alone. The manager recognized me immediately. Her expression softened with the kind of careful sympathy people offer when they know pieces of your story but not all of it. Mrs. Reed. I smiled gently. Actually, I said with more peace than bitterness, it's Evelyn Parker again. Funny how reclaiming your own name can feel more romantic than any vow ever spoken. The ballroom looked smaller than I remembered. No string quartet. No champagne tower. No illusion. Just polished wood floors, afternoon light spilling through tall windows, and rows of empty chairs where I had once mistaken performance for promise. I wasn't there for closure. Closure, I had learned, is not a place. It's a decision. I walked slowly to the center of the room, the same place Thomas had slipped a ring onto my finger while guests applauded a future he never intended to honor. And then, very calmly, I set something down on the grand piano near the dance floor. My annulment papers. Not because anyone needed to see them, but because I did. A symbolic ending. Paper for paper. He had handed me fraud disguised as marriage. I returned truth. Outside, snow had begun falling lightly over the Vermont hills, soft and clean like the world was underlining something important. Not every ending is devastation. Some are restoration. That evening, back at my lake house in Connecticut, my family gathered again. Elise helped me light candles. Gregory opened a bottle of Napa Cabernet from the vineyard trip that had, unexpectedly, become the beginning of my real honeymoon, the one where I returned to myself. Margaret arrived late, carrying dessert and 3 new updates on civil judgments against Thomas. Apparently, justice had developed excellent momentum. We laughed. Not the brittle laughter of people pretending pain. Never happened. Real laughter. The kind that only comes after survival. After dinner, I stepped out onto the back porch alone, wrapped in Daniel's old wool coat, looking over the frozen lake silvered by moonlight. For a moment, I thought about every version of myself that had stood on thresholds. The young bride. The grieving widow. The lonely woman who wanted one more chance. And finally, the woman I had become. Not foolish. Not broken. Not ruined. Wiser. Because betrayal did not destroy me. It introduced me to the parts of myself that politeness, grief, and longing had kept too quiet for too long. My phone buzzed once in my coat pocket. A message request. Unknown number. I didn't open it. Some doors do not deserve reopening. Instead, I slipped the phone away and looked out across that still water, breathing in the cold, honest air. Then I whispered something, not to Thomas, not even to Daniel. To myself. You were never hard to love. You were simply too valuable to hand to the wrong person. And for the first time in years, perhaps in my entire life, I believed it completely. So if you're listening to my story and standing in the wreckage of something you thought would save you, hear me carefully. The worst betrayal is not trusting the wrong person. It is believing their deception reduced your worth. It didn't. Sometimes losing the wrong future is how you finally reclaim the life that was always supposed to be yours. I did not get the honeymoon I was promised. I got something better. My name. My family. My peace. And a second chance. Not at love. At myself.